A flight attendant smacked a bottle down near a black family's baby. Seconds later, the father shattered it across the counter, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He struck a crying baby's hand so hard the glass shattered into his skin. If you believe no act of cruelty should go unanswered, subscribe now. You'll have to wait your turn, sir. The words, delivered with a polished edge, cut through the low murmur of the boarding gate like a taut wire snapping. Marcus Layton paused, adjusting the soft cotton sling that held his 1-year-old son, Caleb, securely against his chest. The baby stirred, tiny fingers curling reflexively at the sound of the attendant's voice. Marcus looked up, locking eyes with the source, Trevor Lang, the lead flight attendant for Falcon Air Flight 712. Trevor stood at the edge of the jet bridge like a gatekeeper, arms crossed just tight enough to show resistance but relaxed enough to maintain the illusion of courtesy. His uniform was crisp, his hair combed with military precision, but the forced smile resting on his lips did not reach his eyes. There was something guarded there, something that flickered briefly when he looked at Marcus and the child in his arms. Disapproval, irritation, or something deeper? Marcus inhaled slowly. He was tired, yes, but not disoriented. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, how to politely ask for early boarding to settle Caleb before the rush of the passengers flooded the narrow aisle. His voice was steady when he replied. "I understand. I just thought it would be helpful to—" "I'm sure you did," Trevor interrupted, his tone clipped yet eerily polite. "Boarding protocol applies to everyone equally. You'll board when your group is called a beat of silence followed." Marcus nodded once, suppressing the tightness rising in his chest. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. He shifted his weight to soothe Caleb, who had begun to fidget, his soft whimper lost in the ambient noise of the terminal. Behind him, the line of the passengers shifted restlessly. No one said a word, but several eyes darted toward the interaction with subtle curiosity. When the boarding call finally came for Marcus's group, he stepped forward without another glance at Trevor. The jet bridge smelled faintly of fuel and stale air. Caleb's cheek rested against Marcus's shoulder, his breath warm and steady. The boy was calm again, lulled by the rocking motion of his father's footsteps. But the tension hadn't left Marcus's spine. Something about the encounter gnawed at the edges of his mind. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was dim. The cabin lights softened to a low, amber hue. The overhead compartments clicked shut as passengers jostled past each other, claiming territory with tired glares and stiff politeness. Marcus found his seat near the middle of the plane, an aisle seat with just enough room to maneuver with the baby. He carefully eased Caleb onto his lap, adjusting the sling so the child's legs were free. Caleb blinked sleepily, then reached up with one hand, fascinated by the glow of the reading light above. Trevor moved through the cabin like a man on autopilot, his movements efficient, his face unreadable. But when he passed Marcus's row, his eyes flicked briefly to Caleb. The smile returned, mechanical, practiced, and vanished just as quickly. Marcus caught the glance. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. He tried to shrug it off. Travel always brought out stress in people. Maybe Trevor was just having a rough day. Maybe it had nothing to do with them. Still, the air felt different, charged, like the moment before a storm. Caleb babbled, tapping his hand against the tray table. The rhythmic patter brought a small smile to Marcus's lips. He leaned in close, whispering softly, "Almost home, little man." "Just hang in there," Caleb responded with a delighted squeal, eyes wide with innocent joy. The boarding completed, and the doors sealed with a heavy thunk. The plane began to taxi, a low rumble vibrating through the floor. Marcus fastened his belt and Caleb's safety harness, double-checking the buckles. As the aircraft lifted off the tarmac and climbed into the night sky, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a rare moment of rest. But even in the calm, he couldn't shake the image of Trevor's eyes, the flicker of something unspoken, like a match being struck in the dark. Later, as the plane leveled out and the soft ding of the seatbelt sign faded, Trevor re-emerged from the galley, pushing a beverage cart with practiced ease. He wore his smile again, greeting passengers with hollow pleasantries. When he reached Marcus, the mask slipped slightly. "Can I get you anything?" he asked flatly. Marcus kept his voice measured. "Just a small bottle of water, please. I need it for Caleb's formula." Trevor didn't answer. He simply nodded, then pushed the cart onward without handing him anything. A few moments passed. Caleb stirred again, eyes blinking open. Marcus reached into the diaper bag and pulled out a small thermos, but it was nearly empty. He glanced down the aisle, watching Trevor distribute drinks to the rows ahead. Time passed. 5 minutes, then 10. Trevor returned finally and placed a water bottle on the tray with a dull thunk. The impact was louder than it needed to be. Caleb startled, letting out a sharp cry that echoed through the cabin. Marcus reached out to calm him, placing a reassuring hand on the child's back. He looked up at Trevor, his tone calm but firm. "He's just a baby." Trevor didn't respond. Instead, he turned to leave, but not before glancing back at Marcus with the same cold calculation. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the startled child. Just silence. Marcus looked at the bottle, condensation sliding down its surface. He reached for it, but at the same moment, Caleb's tiny fingers reached out too, grabbing at the plastic with innocent curiosity. And then it happened. Trevor, perhaps intending to swat the hand away or reclaim the bottle, moved suddenly. His hand swung with more force than necessary. The bottle struck the baby's hand, hard. There was a sharp crack of plastic against skin, followed by a thin, high-pitched wail. Blood welled from a small gash, staining Caleb's fingers. For a moment, the world went still. Then the cabin erupted. A man gasped audibly from 2 rows up. Someone shouted, "What just happened?" Another passenger fumbled for their phone. Marcus froze, his breath caught in his throat, unable to move for a split second as Caleb screamed against his chest. Trevor stepped back, pale and rigid. "It was reflex," he mumbled, but the words didn't land. They were empty. No one listened. The air was charged now, thick with outrage and disbelief. Marcus cradled Caleb close, his mind catching up with what had just happened. The blood, the cry, the look in Trevor's eyes. Something inside him shifted, like a door slamming shut. This wasn't an accident. Not really. It had been a moment of anger, disguised as protocol. And now, everything had changed. Sometimes, storms begin in the quietest skies. The sharp sound of shattering glass cut through the low hum of the aircraft like a gunshot. Caleb's high-pitched scream followed instantly, raw, piercing, and unbearably human. It tore through the calm atmosphere of the dimmed cabin, freezing conversations mid-sentence and snapping passengers' attention toward row 12. Some gasped. Others merely turned, wide-eyed, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. Marcus's heart slammed into his chest. For a moment, time slowed, stretching the milliseconds into a drawn-out horror. His eyes flicked downward, and the sight hit him harder than the sound had. Bright red blood trailing down his infant son's tiny fingers, pooling along the edge of the tray table and dripping onto Marcus's jeans. Caleb's little hand trembled, his fingers spasming as he shrieked uncontrollably, a sob that carried more pain than any child should ever feel. Trevor Lang stood frozen beside them, one arm still halfway extended, the half-empty water bottle trembling in his grip. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like he couldn't decide whether to speak or flee. It was just a reflex," Trevor muttered finally, his voice flat and breathless, as if the air had been yanked from his lungs. Marcus didn't respond immediately. His instincts had taken over. One arm wrapped tightly around Caleb's body, pulling him protectively against his chest, while his other hand fumbled through the seat-back pocket for napkins. Anything to stop the bleeding. His mind raced, but kept locking on the same thought. He hurt my son. He hit him. Caleb wailed louder, his entire body shaking. Blood continued to seep through the napkins Marcus pressed against the wound. The small white cloth turned a horrifying shade of pink. "You struck him," Marcus said, his voice low, vibrating with disbelief. His eyes rose to meet Trevor's. "You actually struck him." Trevor looked around as if hoping someone else would step in. Maybe another flight attendant, maybe a passenger, but no one did. The silence from the nearby seats was deafening. A man across the aisle sat upright, blinking rapidly. Another young man leaned forward, phone halfway raised, already recording. The only sound that broke through the tension was Caleb's relentless sobbing. "I didn't mean to," Trevor said, softer now. "He reached out and you reacted by swinging a bottle," Marcus snapped, the rage building beneath his controlled tone. "At a baby." A tall business traveler seated beside the aisle, Julian Trent, stood abruptly. His face was pale. "I saw it," he said to no one in particular. "He hit the kid's hand." That wasn't a nudge. Trevor took a small step back, holding his hands up as if surrendering. His mouth quivered. It was an accident." Marcus leaned back into his seat, rocking Caleb gently while holding pressure to the wound. His voice dropped again, colder than before. "You think calling it an accident makes it disappear?" Across the aisle, a woman called out in alarm. "Is there a doctor on board?" "That child needs help." The words cracked the stillness like a whip, igniting the passengers into murmuring and shifting in their seats. Heads turned, phones began to record, and the quiet bubble of in-flight anonymity dissolved. Trevor, still standing beside Marcus's seat, looked helpless now, sweating, lips twitching. I'll get the first aid kit," he stammered, backing away down the aisle. Marcus didn't trust his voice anymore. He nodded numbly as Caleb whimpered, eyes puffy and wet, cheeks streaked with tears and sweat. The napkin was soaked, the blood still warm against Marcus's hand. The sight was unbearable. A new voice entered the moment, calm but urgent. "Let me take a look." "I'm a paramedic," the man said. He was in his late 20s, brown hair tucked under a baseball cap, wearing a gray hoodie. His name tag, still clipped to his bag, read Leon Hayes. He crouched beside Marcus without waiting for permission, eyes assessing the injury quickly. "I need to apply clean gauze and elevate the hand. He's lost a bit of blood, but I think we can control it. You holding him like that is perfect. Don't move." Marcus nodded silently, grateful but barely processing. The adrenaline drowned out everything except the sound of his son's whimpers and the blood pulsing in his own ears. Leon unzipped a small pouch, retrieving sterile cloth and a gauze pad. As he worked swiftly but gently, he looked up. "You all right, man?" "No," Marcus said honestly, "but I'm not leaving him." Leon gave a single nod of respect. Passengers continued murmuring. A few shouted questions at the crew. One elderly man called out angrily, "You can't strike a baby and call it service." Another shouted, "What airline is this again?" Trevor returned moments later with the first aid kit in hand but didn't approach. He handed it off to another crew member, who immediately passed it to Leon and stepped back. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Please remain calm and stay seated. We're aware of the situation and are coordinating with our cabin crew to provide support. We ask for your cooperation," but no words could restore the peace that had been shattered. Marcus's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from rage barely held in check. He looked down at Caleb, whose sobs had softened into soft, broken hiccups. A crimson smear stained his son's sleeve. The image seared itself into Marcus's memory. "You don't get to hurt my son and walk away," he whispered under his breath, each word sharp and full of promise. His eyes locked on Trevor once more. Pain turned silence into thunder that no one could ignore. The bottle struck harder than Trevor intended. A sharp crack echoed off the cabin walls, followed by a high, piercing wail that cut through the ambient hum of the aircraft. Caleb's tiny body jerked as glass splintered, slicing into the soft flesh of his hand. For a second, everything around Marcus went silent, time folding into the cry of his son, now rising into a desperate, shattering scream that pulled gasps from the passengers nearby. Marcus's body snapped into motion, instincts overtaking thought. He lunged forward, his hands trembling as he caught Caleb against his chest. Bright red drops smeared across his arm, staining the gray cotton of his shirt like ink spilled on paper. His breath hitched. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice hoarse with panic. The sight of blood on his child, made the air suddenly feel too thin. Trevor Lang took an unsteady step back, his eyes locked on the infant's bleeding hand. His face, moments ago tight with irritation, drained of color. It was an accident," he muttered, hands raised halfway like they might shield him from blame. But Marcus saw past the words. He saw what no excuse could mask: the flash of annoyance in Trevor's swing, the clenched jaw, the narrowed eyes. That had not been an accident. That had been impulse laced with anger. "Medical help!" Marcus shouted, his voice raw. "Somebody, please!" The cabin stirred to life. Heads turned, seatbelts unbuckled. A few passengers reached for call buttons, others raised their phones, already recording. From 3 rows back, a figure stood up fast. A man in his early 30s, tall, with a field medic's pouch slung casually over his shoulder. "I'm a paramedic," he called, stepping over a pair of startled passengers. "Out of the way." He reached Marcus in seconds. "I'm Leon Hayes," he said quickly, kneeling beside them. His voice was calm but commanding. "We need to stop the bleeding." Marcus nodded frantically, shifting to give him space, trying not to jostle Caleb any more than necessary. The baby's cries tore through the air, unrelenting, eyes scrunched in pain. "Wrap something around his hand, tight, but not too tight," Leon said, pulling a clean cloth from his bag. "We need pressure." Marcus pressed the cloth to Caleb's wound with shaking hands, feeling every tremor in his own bones. Caleb screamed louder, writhing against the pain. Leon glanced toward the front of the cabin. "Where's the first aid kit?" he barked. Trevor flinched. He stood frozen near the beverage cart, still holding the offending bottle's twin, untouched. I'll get it," he said, fumbling with the intercom. His voice, once so sharp and dismissive, now quivered through the speaker. "Medical assistance needed. First aid to row 14. A middle-aged passenger in a business suit, seated across the aisle, stood abruptly. He pointed directly at Trevor. "You hit a baby," he said, loud enough for the entire row to hear. His voice shook with fury. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Trevor's shoulders stiffened. "He grabbed it first." "It was a reflex," he replied defensively, but the excuse landed flat. Murmurs surged around the cabin. Phones tilted toward Trevor. The mood shifted. No one bought his explanation. Not after that sound, not after that scream. The captain's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom, stern and official. "All passengers, please remain calm and seated. We're aware of the situation and are coordinating with our crew. Order must be maintained, but order had already unraveled." The tension in the cabin was electric, eyes darting between Marcus, Trevor, and the crying child still cradled in the father's arms. Leon continued working, carefully applying a bandage, whispering soft reassurances to Caleb despite the chaos around him. Marcus's heart pounded like a war drum. His jaw clenched as he turned to face Trevor fully, his eyes glinting with a fury that had been simmering since the gate. "You hit my son," he said, his voice low but full of heat. "A baby. You don't get to do that and walk away." Trevor backed another step toward the galley. "I didn't mean—" "No," Marcus snapped, stepping forward. "You meant to teach me a lesson for asking politely. You meant to remind me I'm beneath you." His voice wasn't raised, but it sliced cleanly through the air, louder than any shout. Even Leon, now standing beside him, seemed taken aback by the weight of it. Trevor's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Marcus took another step, now inches away. The cabin watched in frozen silence. "You don't get to hurt my son and walk away." Justice begins where excuses end. Trevor stepped back from the center aisle, pale and visibly shaken. His retreat toward the galley was hesitant, as though unsure whether to flee or brace for what was coming. The cabin, moments ago alive with gasps and murmurs, had fallen into a heavy silence. Only the faint sobs of baby Caleb echoed, muffled but heart-wrenching, cradled now in the steady arms of Leon Hayes. The young paramedic knelt by row 14, dabbing gently at the bandaged hand with practiced care, his brows furrowed in silent concentration. But Marcus Layton wasn't done. He moved down the aisle with a quiet force, each step deliberate. There was no aggression in his posture, no raised voice, no clenched fists. Just a presence, controlled, centered, dangerous in its calm. Trevor turned at the sound of Marcus's shoes on the carpet, his eyes darting around the galley for support that wouldn't come. The other flight attendants had slipped away, stunned by what had just occurred. The cabin crew had become ghosts. The captain hadn't yet appeared, and the air marshal, if there was one, hadn't intervened. "You struck a child," Marcus said, his voice low and certain, each word weighted like iron. There was no tremor in his tone. Just fact, the kind of truth that couldn't be escaped or reasoned away. Trevor's hands trembled as he instinctively reached toward the beverage cart. I didn't mean to. It was just reflex." He grabbed at it, he stammered, picking up another bottle almost defensively, as if reenacting the moment might prove his innocence. "It's not like I—" But Marcus's restraint snapped. In a swift motion, Marcus's hand darted toward the same tray and grabbed an identical glass bottle, one of those flimsy, complimentary beverages they used to pacify passengers. He didn't hesitate. With a sharp swing, he brought the bottle down on the metal countertop of the galley. The impact rang through the plane like a bell struck at midnight. Glass exploded outward, shards flaring in every direction, catching the overhead light in glinting bursts. A few pieces clattered against the floor. Others landed in a silver bin nearby. The jagged edges sparkled like splinters of judgment, falling quiet after the scream of their arrival. Trevor froze mid-breath, his mouth ajar, the bottle in his own hand forgotten. The air around them thickened, not with smoke or chaos, but something colder. Awareness. A collective shift in the atmosphere, like a tide suddenly pulling out before the crash of a wave. The passengers, dozens of them, sat unmoving in their seats, their heads turned toward the rear galley. Phones still recording, eyes wide with disbelief. But no one dared speak. Even the faint hum of the engines seemed to hush in reverence. Marcus stepped closer, his voice once again composed. "That's how it feels to break something fragile." The words dropped like a stone. Not a shout, not a threat, just a statement. A mirror held up to Trevor's cowardice, a truth that cut deeper than any glass. Before Trevor could reply, before he could even put down the bottle he no longer had the right to hold, the captain finally emerged from the cockpit. Captain Reese Langford, a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and the firm bearing of authority, stepped briskly into the aisle. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," he said to Marcus, gesturing toward the front of the cabin. Marcus turned slowly, meeting the captain's gaze without flinching. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "This man saved his child's life. Control your crew first," Leon said from behind. He had risen, still holding Caleb gently, his paramedic bag beside him on the floor. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, measured, with the weight of someone who'd seen too many people bleed from too many mistakes. The captain hesitated, caught off guard. It wasn't in the manual, how to handle a situation where the passenger was calm, the crew guilty, and the entire cabin watching for what kind of leader he would be. Marcus took a final step back and nodded toward Leon, now holding his child as though he were the only one on board with any real sense of duty. "I'm not the problem," Marcus said quietly. "He is." Captain Langford looked at Trevor, whose knees had nearly buckled. The younger man was pale, sweating, hands hanging limply by his sides. His uniform, once crisp and smug, now looked hollow, like a costume stripped of meaning. The power dynamic shifted before anyone could officially acknowledge it. A quiet mutiny not of violence, but of conscience. The murmurs that had died down began again, slowly. But they were different now. Quieter, aligned. A few passengers began to nod. One man near the back whispered, "He's right." Another leaned into the aisle, eyes narrowed at Trevor. The moment had changed something fundamental. It wasn't about the airline anymore. It was about a man, a child, and the line between power and cruelty. Trevor backed into the galley wall, swallowed hard, and looked around. For the first time he seemed aware of how alone he was. The captain, still uncertain, gave a tight nod. "Return to your seat for now, Mr. Layton," he said, but the edge in his voice had dulled. Marcus didn't argue. He gave one last glance at the broken glass on the counter, then at Trevor, whose eyes darted anywhere but back at him. He turned and walked down the aisle. Each step felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because silence had broken. Witnesses had awakened. Passengers moved slightly in their seats as he passed. One man patted Marcus's arm. Another offered a quiet, "We saw everything." Leon stepped forward, placing Caleb back in Marcus's arms with care. The child whimpered softly but had stopped crying, his head resting against his father's shoulder. The plane was still in the air, but the story had already landed in every heart aboard. Marcus didn't need applause or sympathy. He needed change. And now, the storm had a face. Respect isn't given by uniform, it's earned by humanity. The wheels of the aircraft screeched against the runway as Flight 712 touched down at Northwell International Airport in an emergency landing. The cabin, once humming with fearful murmurs, fell into a stunned silence. The engines whined low, the seatbelt signs still glowing. Before the plane had even reached the gate, emergency vehicles were already swarming the tarmac, red lights spinning against the early dusk, casting flickering shadows through the cabin windows. Marcus Layton stood the moment the plane stopped. He held Caleb tightly in his arms, the child's tiny hand swaddled in layers of gauze, still stained faintly with blood. Caleb had cried himself into exhaustion, his head resting against Marcus's shoulder in a fragile calm. When the flight doors opened, a team of EMTs rushed aboard with stretchers and kits, followed by 2 uniformed airport police officers. "We need to take the child for examination," one paramedic said firmly, stepping forward with outstretched arms. "No," Marcus said at once, his voice low but unyielding. He shifted slightly, keeping his body between Caleb and the man. "Not until I know he'll be safe." "I'm not letting him go." The lead EMT, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, paused. He looked into Marcus's eyes, reading not aggression, but the fierce resolve of a father who had just watched his child be hurt by someone entrusted to protect passengers. He gave a small nod. "Then we'll treat him in your arms. We just need to assess the bleeding." Behind them, Trevor Lang was cornered near the galley. The officers were already questioning him, their expressions stern. Trevor's hands trembled as he stammered explanations, his voice barely audible over the growing noise from the exit rows. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a thin, sweating panic. Passengers began filing off the plane, but many paused, handing their phones to the officers, showing video clips of the moment Caleb was struck. One man, a traveler in a gray suit, spoke clearly as he pointed at Trevor. "That's the guy. He hit the child, hard. We all saw it." Another man, younger and wearing earbuds around his neck, added, "There's no way that was a reflex." He swung with force. Trevor's eyes darted around the cabin as if searching for an escape, but none came. Every face he met turned away coldly. Even the co-pilot standing nearby avoided his gaze. A uniform didn't shield him now. On the tarmac, Marcus descended the steps slowly, still clutching Caleb. The flashing lights of ambulances reflected in his weary eyes. A PR team from Falcon Air was already waiting just beyond the airport's security perimeter, well-dressed and unnervingly calm. One of them, a tall man in a navy blazer, his hair neatly parted, stepped forward with a rehearsed expression of concern. "Mr. Layton, I'm Ronith Drew from Falcon Air's Corporate Relations Division," he said, offering a hand Marcus didn't take. "We are deeply sorry for what occurred. This is a very unfortunate misunderstanding. We'd like to offer private assistance and ensure your comfort. In exchange, perhaps we could discuss a way to resolve this matter discreetly." Marcus stared at him in disbelief. Caleb stirred slightly in his arms, letting out a soft whimper. The words, "resolve this matter," hung in the air like a stain. "You're offering money," Marcus said quietly, but it wasn't a question. "To bury this?" Renat's smile faltered for the briefest second. "We just want what's best for everyone." Emotions are high, and sometimes the public doesn't understand the complexities of these situations. Marcus's jaw tightened. He shifted Caleb gently in his arms. "My son isn't a situation," he said. "He's a baby. And he was assaulted by your employee. We're prepared to be generous," Ronath added carefully, reaching into his coat for a thin folder. "If you're willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement—" "Stop." Marcus's voice was now louder, firmer, and the officers nearby turned slightly at the tone. "You think this ends with silence?" Renat's mouth opened, but nothing came. Marcus stepped past him without another word. Outside the terminal, Leon Hayes waited by a police cruiser. He hadn't left Marcus's side since the plane landed. As soon as Marcus emerged, Leon stepped forward. "How's he doing?" Leon asked, his face lined with concern. "Stable," Marcus replied. "They're going to run tests at the hospital, but the bleeding's under control." "Thanks to you. I meant it when I said I'll testify," Leon said, walking beside him as they approached a waiting ambulance. "Whatever they try to spin, I saw everything." Marcus nodded, appreciating the presence of someone who had nothing to gain, only the truth to protect. Later that evening, Marcus sat in a sterile hospital room. Caleb slept in a small cot beside the window, hooked up to monitors beeping quietly in rhythm with his tiny heartbeat. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Marcus's phone sat in his lap, buzzing every few seconds with new notifications. The video had gone viral. Clips recorded by passengers had been uploaded within hours. The footage was clear, damning. A flight attendant swinging a glass bottle, a baby screaming in pain, a father crying out in panic. The hashtags had already taken over social media feeds. "Justice for Caleb" trended in multiple cities. News outlets called for statements. Journalists began to piece together Falcon Air's reputation, and some found troubling past complaints buried under corporate statements of internal resolutions. But Marcus knew what was coming next. They would deny, deflect, distract. They would offer polished sound bites and carefully worded apologies. They would highlight Trevor's record of service, frame the strike as an unfortunate incident, and emphasize the airline's commitment to continuous staff training. All while whispering threats behind closed boardroom doors. That's how corporations survived. But Marcus wasn't interested in survival. He was interested in change. As the hospital room settled into quiet, Marcus rose and stood by the window, staring out at the glowing skyline. His hand gently rested on Caleb's blanket. The city beyond was unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He opened a new message and began typing, this time not to a news outlet, but to someone who had once told him, "If you ever need me for anything, big, anything where the system's rigged against you, you call." He typed the name, Elijah Crane. Then he looked at his reflection in the darkened glass. He saw not a software engineer, not a father coming back from a funeral. He saw a man with a mission, because this wasn't just about a bruise. It wasn't even about Trevor anymore. It was about how people in power allowed silence to become policy, and how someone had to tear that silence apart. He glanced back once more at Caleb, asleep but safe. Then he whispered the thought that had been burning in his mind since the bottle shattered in that metal galley. When truth bleeds, it stains more than hands. It stains systems. Marcus sat in the hospital's waiting room, his elbows resting on his knees, hands folded tightly together as if holding something fragile. But there was nothing in his grip, only the trembling weight of memory. The events from the flight looped endlessly in his mind, the sharp arc of Trevor's arm, the sound of shattering glass, and the scream that erupted from his son's throat. He could still feel the warmth of Caleb's blood soaking through his shirt, the way the baby's tiny fingers convulsed in pain. No matter how many times he blinked, the image refused to fade. Outside the window, daylight crawled slowly across the pavement, painting the tiles in strips of colorless light. Inside, the waiting room hummed with low conversation and the occasional shuffle of feet. Nurses passed in and out of double doors. A security officer lingered near the entrance, watching the news coverage playing silently on the mounted TV. The headline burned into the corner of the screen. Flight attendant accused of striking infant mid-flight. The footage looped silently. Grainy clips from passengers' phones showing Trevor's stiff posture, Marcus's voice rising in fury, and Caleb's cry punctuating the stillness of the cabin like a siren. Marcus barely noticed when a young nurse approached and gently tapped his shoulder. "Mr. Layton?" "The doctor says Caleb is stable. He's resting now. You can go in if you like." He stood too quickly, dizzy for a moment, but he managed a nod. The hallway to the pediatric wing felt longer than it was. Behind each curtain, he passed fathers holding babies, mothers feeding toddlers, quiet machines monitoring the fragile rhythm of childhood. When he reached Caleb's room, he hesitated only briefly before pushing open the door. The sight undid him. Caleb was asleep, his tiny arm wrapped in gauze and resting gently on his chest. His mouth twitched with the remnants of a dream, and his dark curls were matted with sweat. Marcus stepped inside silently, brushing his thumb across the baby's forehead. The touch was feather-light, but still, Caleb stirred. His eyes fluttered open. "Hey, little man," Marcus whispered, crouching beside the crib. "Daddy's right here." The doctor entered a few minutes later, a tall man in navy scrubs with a steady voice. "There's no fracture," he explained. "The cut was deep but clean. No tendon damage. He'll heal well. Just keep the bandage dry and watch for infection." Marcus nodded, grateful, but the relief was brief. Healing flesh didn't mend what was broken inside him. Later that morning, Leon appeared with 2 paper cups of hospital coffee and a quiet resolve in his step. He sank into the chair beside Marcus, eyes fixed on the child behind the crib bars. "I've been following the coverage," Leon said softly. "They're already twisting it. Falconer's calling it a misunderstanding, like you overreacted." Marcus exhaled sharply through his nose. "I knew they would. They'll try to rewrite it before the ink even dries." "They didn't expect the footage to go viral," Leon replied, "but that won't stop them. I've seen this before. Control the narrative. Bury the story. Make you sound unstable." Marcus turned toward him, his voice low and steady. "Then we burn their script." Leon hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "You need legal firepower, Marcus." "I know a guy. Elijah Crane. Ruthless in the courtroom. He took on Western Delta last year and made them settle before trial." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I've heard of him. Doesn't lose often." Leon nodded. and he doesn't scare easy." Without another word, Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing. Minutes later, he was speaking directly to Elijah, his voice calm but clipped. "It's not just about compensation," Marcus said. "It's about accountability. They hit my son." There was a pause on the other end. Then Elijah's voice, measured, professional, cut through. "Then we make them answer for it. But you need to be ready. They'll try to bury this under legal jargon and press releases. They'll say you provoked it, twist witness statements, throw everything they have." "I'm ready," Marcus replied, eyes never leaving his son. "Whatever it takes." Elijah laid out the first steps, gathering all footage, securing witness testimonies before memories faded, and documenting every interaction moving forward. "They'll play dirty," he warned, "but we'll play smart." The rest of the day blurred into phone calls, media alerts, and rapid coordination. Marcus barely left the hospital. He watched as news cycles spun in real time, some anchors speaking with outrage, others with suspicious detachment. Online comment sections became battlegrounds, flooded with both support and skepticism. The footage had captured the act, but people were already dissecting Marcus's tone, Caleb's volume, even Trevor's posture. "He looked startled," one article read. Could it have been a reflex? Marcus shut the screen. He didn't need validation from strangers. He needed justice. That night, after Caleb had fallen back asleep, Marcus walked alone to the vending machine corridor. The fluorescents buzzed overhead, and the floor tiles were cold beneath his shoes. He leaned against the wall, arms folded tightly, mind racing with strategies. Not once did he question whether he should continue. The path ahead was steep, filled with legal traps and public scrutiny. But he wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He stared at the blacked-out monitor of the vending machine, seeing his reflection ghosted back at him, eyes tired, jaw clenched, shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night. A father. He returned to Caleb's room quietly and sat in the chair beside the crib, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest. His fingers curled into fists again, not from anger this time, but from purpose. Tomorrow would begin a fight against something much bigger than Trevor Lang. It would be against a system that tried to silence the vulnerable, that wrapped cruelty in professionalism, that placed reputation above accountability. Marcus leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for himself to hear. "They hit my son," he said quietly. "Now I'll make them answer for it." The first strike of the real battle had begun. Sometimes the smallest hand can shake the mightiest empire. The courtroom fell into silence as the judge entered, his robe trailing like a shadow behind the bench. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight, hands tightly clasped in his lap. Beside him, Elijah Crane adjusted his tie with quiet precision, eyes already fixed on the opposing counsel. The air was thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, cameras occasionally clicking when allowed. Outside, protesters' chants could be faintly heard through the double-paned windows. Pleas for justice, for accountability, for truth. The case of Leighton versus Falconer was underway. Victor Dran, Falconer's lead attorney, rose with practiced grace. His silver cufflinks glinted under the fluorescent lights, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth like silk laced with ice. "We acknowledge the unfortunate incident aboard Flight 712, but we must emphasize that the event in question was a reflex, an unintentional reaction to a perceived threat." Mr. Lang, the flight attendant, acted instinctively. What followed was a series of escalations driven by emotional overreaction. Marcus's jaw tightened. He could feel his pulse in his throat. Elijah placed a calming hand on his arm without looking at him. The judge gave a slow nod. "Proceed." Victor gestured to the screen beside him. Grainy footage played. The moment Trevor's arm swung, the baby's startled cry, the sharp intake of breath from passengers. but the video had no sound. Victor timed his narration to paint Trevor as startled, even remorseful. Elijah stood. "Objection. Incomplete context. Sustained," the judge replied. "Let's hear the full footage." With a swift motion, Elijah cued the original recording, this time with audio. The courtroom listened as Trevor's bottle made contact with Caleb's hand, followed by a crystal-clear baby's wail and gasps of alarm. And then, subtle but damning, Trevor's voice. "Maybe now he'll stop grabbing things." A ripple moved through the courtroom, the murmur of disbelief, of recognition. Elijah let it hang in the air before speaking. "What you just heard," he said, turning to the jury, "is not a reflex. That is resentment, articulated moments after physical harm. That is a deliberate action masked as protocol. And that," he turned back toward Victor, "is the truth they're trying to bury." Victor's smile faltered just slightly, but then the defense pivoted. "Your Honor, we call Neil Ward to the stand." Marcus flinched. Elijah's brow furrowed. Neil Ward, young, nervous, and until now unmentioned, entered the courtroom and took the witness chair. "Mr. Ward," Victor said, "were you present at Gate 17 during pre-boarding of Flight 712? Neil nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." "Did you witness Mr. Layton interacting with crew?" Neil hesitated, then glanced at Victor, whose expression remained cold and steady. "He was loud. Upset when we denied early boarding. I remember him raising his voice. Marcus's heart dropped. The lie struck him like ice water. His breath caught in his chest. Elijah stood quickly. "Mr. Ward," he began, tone calm but cutting, "did you record any of this alleged shouting?" "No, sir," Neil said quietly. "Did anyone else report it?" I don't know." Elijah took a slow step forward. "Or did someone suggest you remember it differently?" Neil blinked, shifting uncomfortably. Elijah's voice lowered. "Did anyone at Falcon Air ask you to say this today?" Before Neil could respond, Victor objected sharply. "Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained." "Move on, Mr. Crane." But Marcus had already seen it, the flicker of guilt in Neil's eyes, the doubt trembling in his words. That evening, the courtroom emptied. Marcus sat in Elijah's office, staring at the floor. The lights were dim, the hum of the city below muffled by thick glass windows. His mind replayed Neil's testimony, again and again, trying to pinpoint the moment betrayal took shape. The door creaked open. Leon stepped in, his face pale, urgency in his voice. "I need to tell you something." Marcus stood. "What is it?" "I was at that steakhouse by the courthouse tonight," Leon said, his voice low. "Two guys from Falcon Air's legal team were at the next table. They didn't recognize me. I heard them laughing, talking about how they'd bought a couple of quiet mouths and that Neil finally folded." Marcus's fists clenched. "They're paying off witnesses," Leon continued. "This isn't just a defense." "It's a cover-up," Elijah, now standing, met Marcus's eyes. "They're setting up a narrative," he said, voice firm. "We'll dismantle it." Marcus nodded slowly, a fire building in his chest. The courtroom wasn't just a battleground now, it was a mirror for every system that failed the truth. The city lights flickered through the window as Marcus stared into the night, his voice quiet, heavy with resolve. When lies become currency, truth becomes rebellion. He hit a black infant with a glass bottle, watching him scream as shards dug into his tiny hand. If you believe power means responsibility, not abuse, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The news broke late in the evening, just as Elijah Crane was sorting through a stack of subpoena responses. The court had approved their preliminary discovery requests, but Falcon Air's legal team had returned only sanitized reports, redacted memos, vague witness summaries, and dozens of documents marked "No further action taken." It was a legal smokescreen, and Elijah knew it, But Trevor's sudden vanishing? That was something else entirely. Marcus stood beside the window of Elijah's office, the city lights of Northwell flickering like nervous thoughts. "You're telling me they moved him?" he asked, arms folded tight across his chest. Caleb's hospital ID still looped around his wrist. Elijah didn't look up. He was staring at a screen, frowning. "Not just moved. Buried. One of my investigators tracked an overseas transfer last week. A passenger manifest shows a Trevor L. on a corporate jet headed to Argentos, a country without an extradition treaty." Marcus's stomach turned. "They hid him." "No," Elijah said, eyes narrowing. "They're protecting him." The room felt colder than it should have despite the humming heater. For the first time, Marcus understood this wasn't just a court case. It was a machine, well-oiled, well-funded, and deeply afraid of being exposed. Trevor wasn't just a rogue employee, he was a symptom, and Falconer was doing everything it could to ensure the disease stayed hidden. "We need to go wider," Marcus said. "This isn't just about one flight." "There's more. I can feel it." Elijah nodded slowly. "Then we bring the storm to them." That night, they began their counter-offensive. Elijah reached out to his network, former airline employees, labor attorneys, investigative journalists. Marcus combed forums, message boards, anywhere passengers had logged complaints. And within 48 hours, the cracks started to show. A man named Terrence Doyle, a retired gate agent from Falconer, agreed to speak under anonymity. He met Marcus and Elijah in a dimly lit diner on the edge of town, his hands trembling around a coffee mug. "They used to call it the black folder," Terrence said, eyes scanning the room. "If a complaint came in that could hurt the brand, it got flagged and sealed. We weren't allowed to follow up. The system marked it resolved internally, even when nothing happened." Marcus leaned forward. "How many complaints?" Terrence chuckled bitterly. "Too many to count. Most of them from people of color, families with kids, people who didn't look like first-class material. They wanted passengers to feel watched, but never safe." The words hit Marcus like a slap. He gripped the edge of the table. "Did Trevor Lang have complaints?" Terrence nodded. "3 I know of. One was from a guy who said Trevor pushed his wife's stroller so hard it tipped. Another said he shouted at a man in a turban for asking too many questions. Both were silenced." Back in Elijah's office, the air was thick with tension. Elijah tapped furiously at his keyboard, assembling affidavits and organizing testimony. Then an anonymous email dropped into his inbox. The sender's name was simple: K47. Subject: For the child. Attached were 3 documents. Falconer training materials marked confidential. The first was titled Maintaining Assertive Passenger Control. It outlined behavior guidelines that encouraged decisive verbal correction and non-negotiable boundaries for problematic demographics. The language was thinly veiled, but the intent screamed through every line. The second was a supervisor flowchart for diffusing undesirable passenger profiles before escalation. The third was an internal memo from the Director of In-Flight Services urging attendants to remain firm and fearless in enforcement, even if complaints arise. Protect the brand first, Marcus's face tightened with rage. They trained them to act like this. They told them to, "We can't sit on this," Elijah said, printing copies. "We need the court to compel Falconer to produce Trevor." Now by morning, Elijah filed an emergency injunction. His petition was backed by the leaked documents, the whistleblower email, and sworn statements from 2 former employees. The judge, an aging but sharp-eyed man named Justice Darrow, read through the filing in a closed hearing. He raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the memo pages. "You're telling me," he said to Falconer's counsel, "that your client cannot locate one of its senior employees after transferring him overseas under a different ID?" Victor Drawn, Falconer's attorney, adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, Mr. Lang is on extended personal leave. and we were under the impression he was unavailable for health reasons. Is he in hiding, Mr. Drawn? Darrow's voice was low but dangerous. The courtroom went silent. I'm granting the injunction, the judge declared. Falconer will produce Mr. Lang within 5 days or face contempt of court. Outside, the air felt charged. The media caught wind before Elijah even stepped off the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Headlines ran within the hour. Falconer ordered to reveal hidden attendant in baby injury case. Social media exploded. Hashtags spread like fire. Protesters began gathering outside Falconer's corporate office. Marcus watched it all from a distance, holding Caleb close in the quiet of his apartment. Not smiling, not triumphant, just resolved. They had cracked the wall, but what lay behind it was only beginning to reveal itself. Falconer's empire began to tremble, not because of lawyers, but because of one father's refusal to stay silent. The moment truth steps into daylight, shadows scatter. When Trevor Lang finally took the witness stand, a hushed anticipation settled over the courtroom like fog. He looked nothing like the smug flight attendant seen in earlier footage. His cheeks were hollow, his blazer hung loose on his frame, and his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. He avoided Marcus's gaze entirely, staring down at the wood grain of the witness box, fingers twitching at the hem of his sleeve. A low murmur buzzed through the crowd of journalists, activists, and spectators packed into the gallery, each waiting for what might be the moment everything unraveled. Elijah Crane, seated beside Marcus at the plaintiff's table, rose slowly. He adjusted his tie, then stepped forward with the deliberate precision of a man who knew exactly where he was about to strike. The courtroom temperature seemed to drop. Mr. Lang, Elijah began, voice calm but firm. You understand you are under oath? Trevor nodded without looking up. Yes, he said, barely above a whisper. Good. Elijah walked a slow circle, then stopped just a few feet from the witness stand. Let's revisit the moment in question. Did you, or did you not, strike the child with a glass bottle? Trevor swallowed hard. It wasn't like that. I didn't hit him. Elijah raised a hand. A yes or no, please. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Yes, but I didn't mean to. Did you strike the child intentionally? Elijah asked, eyes narrowing. The words hung in the air. Trevor's mouth opened, then closed. He blinked several times, glancing toward his attorney, Victor Dran, who gave a subtle shake of the head, as if warning him to stick to the rehearsed line. But the silence became heavier with each second. The judge's gavel had not been needed in over an hour, yet the tension in the room was louder than any outburst. I didn't mean to hurt him, Trevor said finally, his voice hoarse, but I was tired of being disrespected by passengers like him. The sentence hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled across the gallery. A woman in the second row clutched her notepad tighter. A reporter's pen froze mid-sentence. Marcus felt a chill crawl down his spine. His jaw tightened. He had prepared for evasions, denials, rehearsed remorse. But not this. Elijah didn't flinch. He leaned in just slightly, his voice as sharp as a blade. Passengers like him, he repeated. Meaning what exactly, Mr. Lang? Trevor's eyes widened. He seemed to realize, too late, what he had said. His lips parted again, but no sound came. His face paled. Even Victor Dran, who had thus far remained cool and composed, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and adjusted his tie, avoiding eye contact with the jury. I didn't mean it that way, Trevor stammered. Elijah didn't press further. He didn't have to. The courtroom had already drawn its own conclusion. The silence that followed was louder than any denial could have been. The judge banged the gavel once, calling for order as murmurs swelled. Reporters began whispering urgently into phones. Courtroom artists sketched faster, capturing Trevor's frozen expression. It was clear to everyone in the room that something fundamental had just cracked. The judge's voice broke through the clamor. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Trevor stepped down from the witness stand like a man walking through a storm. He kept his eyes down, shoulders hunched, face ashen. Security escorted him out a side door as photographers tried to snap photos from beyond the courtroom windows. Marcus remained seated, hands clasped together, knuckles white. He didn't speak, didn't even blink. His mind spun with emotions, rage, heartbreak, even pity. Here was a man whose quiet prejudice had nearly destroyed his child, and now the world had seen it laid bare. Elijah returned to his seat, offering a brief nod. "He slipped," he whispered, and the world heard it. Marcus didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the space where Trevor had stood. The moment felt surreal, less like victory, more like revelation. And yet, he knew this wasn't the end. Falconer wouldn't fall with a single mistake. They would regroup, recalculate, and come back swinging. But now they had lost their shield of professionalism. The mask had fallen, and the truth, ugly and undeniable, was out. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the echoes of that single sentence lingered. Somewhere beyond the walls, news stations were already updating headlines, social media igniting with clips and commentary. The battle wasn't over, but the scales had shifted. Sometimes the truth doesn't scream. It slips out in a whisper that shakes walls. The courtroom fell silent the moment Elijah Crane stepped forward with the flash drive in his hand. The judge raised a brow, adjusting his glasses slightly as if sensing something significant was about to unfold. Falconer's attorneys exchanged quick glances, their confidence wavering under the stillness. Elijah inserted the drive into the court's audiovisual system and took a slow breath, his voice composed but firm. "Your Honor, we have a new piece of evidence, audio recorded by Malcolm Wren, a ground operations supervisor at Falconer." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "It contains a management call held 2 days after the incident." A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge gave a nod. "Proceed." The playback began with the crackle of a conference call line. Then voices emerged, clear, cold, and corporate. "Marcus Layton is emotional. Make it sound like an exaggeration," said one voice. Another chimed in. "We can't let this grow." Push the crew to realign their statements. Focus on Trevor's stress. Paint the father as aggressive. "We need to contain this." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Marcus sat still, jaw clenched, his eyes burning not with surprise, but with grim confirmation. He had suspected manipulation from the start. Now he heard it, naked and undeniable. Trevor, seated behind Falconer's legal bench, lowered his head, hands trembling in his lap. Whatever illusions he'd held about the company protecting him were gone now. Victor Dran, Falconer's lead attorney, jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This recording is unauthorized and inadmissible. It violates privacy." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Sit down, Mr. Dran." His tone had lost all patience. "This isn't a private conversation. It's a corporate strategy meeting about suppressing a civil complaint. The court will accept the evidence." The tension in the room thickened like smoke. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered around large monitors broadcasting the trial. Protesters held signs. Some wore shirts that read, "I believe Marcus." A boy, perched on his father's shoulders, held a cardboard poster with a crayon drawing of a baby, and the words, "Justice for Caleb." Back inside, Elijah turned toward the jury. This was never about a single mistake. It was about what happened after, about how a company chose to silence truth to protect its name. He turned slightly toward Marcus, then to the judge. "We ask the court to consider not just the act, but the system that allowed it." Victor tried to recover, launching into a dry explanation about corporate stress, employee retention, and how organizations sometimes use harsh language during internal crisis calls. But the momentum had shifted. The jury members leaned forward now, their pens still, their gazes focused not on Victor, but on Marcus. In the back row, Trevor finally lifted his head, eyes glassy. He wasn't just ashamed, he looked betrayed, used. The company that had once told him to stand firm now left him exposed. He whispered something to his lawyer, barely audible, but his posture had changed. He no longer defended the company, he simply endured it. During recess, Marcus stepped outside the courtroom, the heavy doors closing behind him with a solemn thud. A reporter tried to approach, but Leon intercepted, shaking his head. "Not now," he said firmly. Marcus needed air more than answers. He walked slowly to the edge of the courthouse plaza. The wind tugged lightly at his coat. In the distance he saw men talking quietly, fathers holding their sons, a sense of unity forming from shared outrage. He thought about the first moment Caleb had cried out on that plane, how the sound had cut through everything, even time. He had promised then to protect his child no matter what. Now the fight had outgrown him, but the promise remained. That night, long after the cameras stopped flashing and the reporters went home, Marcus stood in the dim light of Caleb's nursery. The hum of the white noise machine filled the background. Caleb slept soundly, a small stuffed elephant tucked under one arm, his bandaged hand almost healed. Marcus reached out, brushing the baby's forehead gently with his fingertips. He didn't speak loudly, just enough for the sleeping boy to hear in dreams. "I promise," he whispered, voice steady, "your pain will build a safer world." Outside the window, the city lights shimmered like scattered stars, each one a reminder of the world waiting to change. And in that quiet, defiant stillness, Marcus reaffirmed what the day had revealed. When power hides behind walls, truth learns to climb. Victor Drawn rose from his chair with quiet confidence, his steps measured as he approached the bench. The defense had been battered with evidence, but this was his final play, a calculated pivot meant to sway the jury by appealing to their compassion. His voice, calm and calculated, carried across the silent courtroom. "We'd like to recall Mr. Trevor Lang to the stand," Drawn announced. There was a stir among the observers. Marcus sat rigid, jaw clenched, Caleb's injury still vivid in his mind. Elijah gave a slight nod, expression unreadable, but his eyes never left Drawn. The judge agreed, and moments later, Trevor Lang re-entered the courtroom through the side door. He looked different now, disheveled, unshaven, suit wrinkled. The once arrogant flight attendant who had swung a bottle at a baby was now gaunt and hunched, the weight of public scrutiny clearly pressing down on his shoulders. As he took the stand, he avoided Marcus's gaze, eyes darting downward. Drawn began gently, his tone sympathetic. "Mr. Lang, can you walk us through the training Falcon Air provided for handling difficult passenger situations?" Trevor hesitated, voice hoarse. There were basic modules. Videos, mostly, scenarios, but not much guidance. "Were you ever instructed on how to handle infants or passengers with special needs?" Trevor shook his head. "No, we were told to maintain order, to be assertive, but the rest was left to us." Victor turned to the jury, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Do you believe the company adequately prepared you for high-stress encounters?" A long pause. Then Trevor muttered, "No." "They told us to be firm." Not careful, Victor paced slowly. "So when Mr. Layton requested water and his baby began crying, would you say you were under stress?" Trevor glanced at Marcus briefly before dropping his gaze. "Yes, I was overwhelmed. Would you describe your action as malicious?" Trevor's voice was a whisper. "No. It wasn't meant to hurt." Murmurs rose in the courtroom. Marcus felt the shift in the room, subtle but real. A few jurors looked down. One even bit his lip in thought. Drawn was tugging at their empathy, painting Trevor as a victim of a broken system. But Elijah was already rising, buttoning his coat slowly, stepping forward with the precision of a man who had waited for this moment. "No further questions?" he asked Victor calmly. "None," Dron replied, returning to his seat with a slight nod. Elijah turned toward the judge. "Permission to approach the witness." "Granted." He stopped a few feet from Trevor, hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Lang," Elijah began, voice soft but charged, "you've stated you were under stress, that the system failed you, that what happened was an accident." Trevor gave a faint nod. "Let's examine that," Elijah continued, then clicked a remote. The courtroom lights dimmed as a screen lit up behind the judge. A still image, Trevor. At the moment, his hand swung the bottle, frozen in time. His jaw was clenched, his brow furrowed, a sneer on his lips. Elijah zoomed in, letting the jury see every detail. "Does this look like someone under duress?" Elijah asked, tone tightening. "Or does this look like someone who let their frustration become cruelty?" Trevor looked at the image, visibly shaken. "I didn't mean—" "But you did strike the child," Elijah cut in. "You felt disrespected. That much you've admitted." Trevor's hands gripped the edges of the stand. I was tired. Of being talked down to. Of being treated like I didn't matter." "And you took that out on an infant?" Trevor hesitated, then sighed deeply. "It wasn't right." "But yes," a sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Elijah stepped closer. "Let's talk about high-risk passengers," he said, pulling a paper from his folder. Falcon Air training memo, dated 3 months prior, encouraging disciplinary assertiveness with such passengers. "Who determines who is high risk, Mr. Lang?" Trevor blinked. "I don't know." "I assumed. Passengers who make trouble? Or passengers who simply ask for water early? Or try to settle an infant?" Trevor didn't answer. Elijah nodded slowly. "Let me help. These are not your words. They're from a chain of internal emails labeled confidential, sent between PR teams and legal counsel. And here," he held up another page, "we find Mr. Dron himself advising, if public anger grows, blame emotional overreaction, deflect, humanize the crew, deny pattern." He handed copies to the judge and jury. The courtroom froze. Dron's face tightened, a flicker of panic behind his usually composed expression. A man from the back rows stood slightly, whispering to a colleague. Reporters furiously typed notes. The tension was no longer under the surface, it was crackling in the air like static before a storm. Elijah turned back to Trevor. "I don't think you're the monster here, Mr. Lang. But I do think you were their shield. And now you're their sacrifice." Trevor stared at the floor. His breathing grew uneven. Then, as if something broke inside him, he looked up, this time straight at Marcus. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Trevor, unreadable, 1,000 thoughts behind them. But he said nothing. The silence between them was louder than any scream. The judge cleared his throat, trying to steady the energy in the room. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Verdict will be delivered at 10 a.m. As the gavel struck, people rose slowly, stunned by what had just unfolded. Some apologies come too late, but they still echo. The courtroom was already filled to capacity by the time Marcus Layton stepped through the double doors, Caleb resting quietly in his arms. The boy stirred gently. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of Marcus's blazer. A cold hush hovered over the room, broken only by the shuffle of reporters setting up their equipment and the occasional murmured prayer from spectators seated along the gallery benches. Flashbulbs snapped as photographers tried to capture Marcus's face, but his expression remained unreadable, composed, yet holding something deeper. The verdict was moments away. Judge Halford entered, his robe flowing as he took his seat behind the bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood in silence. The gavel came down once. "You may be seated," the judge said, his voice calm but commanding. He adjusted his glasses, opened a manila folder, and began to read with measured clarity. "This court has reviewed the evidence, testimony, and witness statements submitted during the course of this case," he began, pausing as the weight of the moment sank into every corner of the room. Marcus's heart pounded, but his gaze didn't waver. Across the aisle, Victor Dran sat with a stoic face, flanked by Falconer's senior counsel. Trevor Lang sat a few seats behind them, head bowed, eyes lost in the grain of the floor. The judge continued. "It is the finding of this court that the defendant, Falconer Corporation, is guilty of negligence, willful misconduct, and violation of civil protection codes." The words struck like thunder, each syllable echoing through the chamber. A collective breath was drawn from the crowd. Then came the ruling. Falconer was to pay substantial damages to Marcus Layton and his family. The airline was further ordered to issue a public apology across all national media platforms and to accept immediate federal oversight for all staff training and passenger safety protocols. But Judge Halford wasn't finished. His eyes lifted from the page, scanning the room. "Additionally," he said, "Falconer is hereby required to fund an independent nonprofit foundation dedicated to promoting ethical conduct and humane treatment within the commercial aviation sector. Leadership of this foundation will fall under Mr. Marcus Layton." Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters scribbled frantically. Behind Marcus, Elijah Crane sat straighter, his lips curling into a small, quiet smile. Leon Hayes placed a steadying hand on Marcus's shoulder, his grip firm, proud. The judge concluded his statement and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Layton, this court recognizes not only the pain you and your son have endured, but the unwavering strength you've demonstrated. It is the hope of this court that today's ruling serves not only as restitution, but as a turning point." A moment of silence followed before the gavel struck again. "Court is adjourned." Applause erupted, not the kind born of celebration, but of vindication. It began softly, then grew, rising like a tide of voices united by the recognition that something had shifted. Justice had been named aloud. But Marcus didn't stand to receive the applause. He remained seated, holding Caleb closer, eyes lowered as if in quiet prayer. "We did it," he whispered, brushing his cheek against his son's soft hair. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the quiet quake of long-contained emotion finally released. Elijah moved toward him, extending a hand. Marcus rose slowly and accepted it. The handshake was firm, steady, one of comrades who had weathered the storm together. Leon joined them, wiping a tear discreetly with the back of his hand before resting it on Caleb's shoulder. As they exited the courtroom, the hallway exploded with camera flashes and shouted questions. "Mr. Layton, any comment on today's verdict? Do you believe Falconer will follow through on the reforms? What does justice mean to you, sir?" Marcus paused just outside the courthouse steps. The cold air kissed his face, and Caleb stirred slightly, blinking at the crowd. The sky above was overcast, a heavy gray sheet rolling over the city like a reminder of the storm they had come through. Microphones pushed toward his face, but Marcus raised his hand for silence. He spoke one line, just one. "Justice isn't revenge, it's remembrance." The ribbon snapped cleanly under Marcus Layton's steady hands. Applause rose like a wave across the open-air plaza outside the new headquarters of the Falcon Initiative. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and a cluster of volunteers held up signs reading, "Dignity in the skies," and "Passengers deserve protection." The moment had arrived, not just a symbolic victory, but the result of months of relentless work, late-night meetings, and hard-won clarity. Beside Marcus stood Elijah Crane, his sharp suit catching the sunlight, and Leon Hayes, arms crossed but a proud grin softening his usually stoic face. The three of them, once thrown together by tragedy, now stood united by purpose. Behind them, a sleek glass building gleamed with the name Falcon Initiative, Center for Passenger Justice and Crew Reform. Caleb, now fully healed and toddling with newfound confidence, stood at Marcus's side. His tiny hand reached out in fascination as the crowd leaned forward. A low murmur of admiration swept through the audience, and Caleb gave an innocent wave that drew gentle laughter. Marcus stepped to the podium. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need to. His eyes moved across the crowd, pausing on the young volunteers, the industry observers, the victims of similar incidents who had come to witness the moment. "No one," Marcus began, his voice low but unwavering, "should fear flying because of who they are or what they carry in their arms." Silence followed, not out of confusion, but reverence. The words settled on the audience like soft weight. He continued, his tone sharpening. "We built this not as a symbol of vengeance, but as a beacon of reform. The Falcon Initiative is here to ensure that the skies remain safe, for children, for parents, for every soul who steps onto an aircraft. We will train with compassion. We will educate with truth. We will speak when others are silenced." Elijah placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his nod slow and approving. Leon gave a thumbs up to a group of new trainees standing nearby, most in uniform, some in civilian clothes. The first batch of workshops had already begun, mandatory for partnering airlines, recommended for others. But what no one had expected, not even Marcus, was what Elijah whispered as they stepped off the stage. He showed up. Marcus's brow furrowed. "Who?" Elijah tilted his head discreetly toward a cluster of volunteers behind the registration table. A man stood there in plain clothes, sweeping floors quietly, placing chairs with methodical precision. His hair was shorter, his body thinner, and his posture humbled, but the face was unmistakable. Trevor Lang. Marcus froze. Not in rage, not in fear, but in a moment of suspended reflection. Trevor didn't look up. He didn't ask for attention. He wore no name tag, and his presence hadn't been publicly acknowledged. Elijah added quietly, "Community sentence." Part of the judge's order. He requested this assignment himself. Anonymously, Marcus exhaled. He thought he would feel disgust or anger, but what washed over him instead was something quieter, heavier, recognition. Trevor had once wielded power with arrogance. Now he held a mop in a place built by the very child he'd harmed. Later that afternoon, Marcus watched one of the training sessions through a tinted glass window. A new flight attendant named Aaron demonstrated how to de-escalate passenger stress with empathy. He quoted the initiative's handbook word for word, but then paused and added, "But real respect isn't in procedures. It's in how we show up every day, especially when no one's watching." The room nodded. So did Marcus. That evening, with the ceremony complete and the crowds gone, Marcus returned home to a quiet apartment overlooking the city skyline. Caleb slept on his chest, warm and safe. The boy's hand twitched in a dream, gripping the fabric of his father's shirt. Marcus didn't move. He watched the shimmer of lights outside his window, thinking of every battle it took to reach this point. The courtrooms, the headlines, the betrayal, the silent allies, the whispers of doubt. He remembered the bottle, the cry, the moment everything changed. And he remembered what he had built in the aftermath. He pressed a kiss to Caleb's forehead and whispered, "You turned pain into purpose, my boy." Outside, the city pulsed with quiet resilience, and beneath it all lay the simple, undeniable truth he had fought so hard to prove. From broken glass, a brighter world was born. He broke a child's hand with a bottle, but minutes later his own pride shattered with it. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding justice, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, arrogance, and the swift consequences of cruelty and disrespect. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, justice, and accountability in the face of discrimination.